So I will make a start then. So I'm Kirsty Cole, and I'm here today, as Tim explained. We want to tell you a bit about how we've used video call interviewing on some of the surveys that NatCen is involved in, and some of the surveys that we work on with the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, and kind of going to share what we've done, but also some of our considerations and things we're discussing internally as we consider whether this might be an effective mode to use going forward. Next slide, please, Carole. Now you can see me. So we're going to talk a bit about the kind of the rationale, why we explored using this approach. I'm going to talk about how we've used it on some of our longitudinal surveys, and Carole is also going to talk about kind of the results or some of the things we've observed as we've used this approach on some of our longitudinal surveys. Mary is going to talk about how we've tested using a video calling approach on some of NatCen's cross-sectional surveys. And then at the end, we're going to have a section where we sort of draw some sort of overall conclusions and consider what the next steps might be. Next slide. Next slide. So just by way of context, this obviously, when the pandemic hit in March 2020, all face-to-face fieldwork stopped and had to be put on hold. We didn't know how long face-to-face fieldwork wasn't going to be possible for, and so we had to think about, how can we continue to collect survey data despite the pandemic. And at the same time, I suppose during the pandemic, video calling became more widely used by people, all sorts of people in their private and business uses. And so on several of our surveys, we explored the use of introducing video call interviewing as an alternative mode. And internally, we've been using this acronym CAVI, computer assisted video call interviewing, although I know there's a bit of debate in wider circles about whether that's a helpful acronym or not. And today we're going to be talking a bit about how we've kind of trialed the use of this mode across a few different surveys. We've implemented it in different ways on different surveys, and on different surveys we've kind of offered this mode in different combinations with other modes, and obviously kind of how we offer the mode and what combinations or options we provide to respondents, that obviously does have an impact on take-up rates and response rates. So that's something we'll also look at. Next slide, please. So in terms of kind of why we investigated this approach, I suppose we were in a situation where we were forced to innovate, to continue to collect data, and the dominant remote modes of collecting data are probably web and telephone. But on paper, at least, we felt that video call interviewing had some benefits over telephone interviewing. And we were quite keen on quite a lot of our surveys to continue with this like an interviewer-led approach. So I suppose we put here potential benefits of video call interviewing particularly compared to telephone interviewing. So there's more opportunities for rapport between the interviewer and the participant because they can see each other. We thought, maybe that means that the respondent feels a bit more comfortable and a bit more able to kind of answer frankly, and maybe they feel like the process is a bit more engaging than it is done over the telephone. And for those reasons, possibly we might expect to see fewer sort of measurement differences between video call interviewing compared to face-to-face interviewing, as opposed to when you compare measurement differences between telephone interviewing and face-to-face interviewing. I suppose one of the other advantages is obviously video call interviewing provides the opportunity for the interviewer to kind of share visual stimulus with the respondent, to show them things on screen or to send links to materials to the respondent. So there's more options for administering kind of a wider range of survey components if you use video call rather than just an ordinary telephone call. And I suppose, and we're also thinking that possibly if we did things by video call rather than telephone, because there's maybe this increased kind of rapport and engagement, possibly that helps improve consent rates to follow-up activities that we might want to ask the respondent to help us with. For instance, on some of our studies, we ask whether people would be willing to have a nurse visit them or to kind of collect certain biological samples following the interview. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about how we've used video call interviewing on some of our longitudinal surveys, and 3 longitudinal surveys in particular. Maybe go on to the next slide, please, Carole. So the 3 longitudinal projects that we've used video call interviewing on are the 1970 British Cohort Study, so these people are in their early 50s now, the National Child Development Study, this cohort are in their early 60s, and also ELSA, the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, which is much wider age range. It's kind of a survey of a cohort of people aged 50 and over. And all 3 of these studies are kind of following a large cohort of individuals, on quite a lot of engaged, quite engaged cohort members, and we do hold quite good contact details for all of them. So for a large proportion of the sample, we hold telephone and email details for them. Next slide, please. And in terms of kind of what sort of information these studies try and collect, I've got a bit of a summary here, and I've put this up to try and help explain why we wanted to explore video call interviewing rather than just trying to do things by telephone, or possibly developing a web survey. So all 3 of these studies collect information on a very wide range of personal factors such as physical and educational development and economic circumstances, employment, family life, health behaviour, well-being, social participation and attitudes. They're all quite long studies, long questionnaires, well over an hour. They're designed to be face-to-face surveys. They include some sensitive questions and show cards, some cognitive assessments, requests for data linkage consents, and also all 3 studies include some self-completion elements that we ask people to fill in either before the interview or during the interview or after the interview. And as I've alluded to, yes, NCDS and ELSA also include some kind of additional components, consent to partner interviews or consent to a nurse visit, things afterwards. And at the time the pandemic hit, I suppose the fieldwork, the plans for fieldwork on all 3 of these studies were already quite well advanced. We'd been planning to do face-to-face interviewing, and we prepared our questionnaires and tools with that in mind. So the interviews as planned couldn't be carried out by telephone, and there'd be considerable kind of upfront or additional investment required to develop web versions of the interviews. And so for all these reasons, we decided to kind of develop a video call interviewing approach. Next slide, please. So this is a bit of a summary of kind of the features of the approach that we developed. We decided to use Microsoft Teams. We looked at a few different video calling platforms and thought about how they might meet our needs. And I guess our priorities were functionality, but also data security was really important. So one of the reasons we went for MS Teams was because it offered end-to-end encryption, as well as some of the functionality we needed. We spent quite a long time developing video calling kind of fieldwork protocols and instructions, kind of thinking about how we wanted fieldwork to work via video call. We had to design video call interviewing training for our interviewers. A lot of our interviewers, kind of very good face-to-face interviewers, but video call interviewing was inevitably new for them. So we had to think about what were the additional skills which interviewers would need to learn, and how could we train them to do that. I guess the additional challenge is that we were doing our training via video call. In terms of what sort of interviewers we used, to start off with, we were primarily using kind of interviewers with field experience, training them to do video call interviewing. But lastly, particularly at NatCen, we've also trained some of the interviewers in our telephone unit to carry out video call interviewing on some of the longitudinal projects. There's another feature of our approach is that we had to exclude people from our sample where we didn't have any telephone or email details for them on file. And yeah, because all contact was remote. And so where possible, we did ask interviewers to try and trace people if they didn't manage to make contact with the telephone and email details they had. But tracing activities are obviously more limited when you don't have the option of going and knocking on doors. Next slide, please. As far as possible, I think on all 3 of our studies, we were trying to use the face-to-face questionnaire, that we'd originally been anticipating, but we did have to make some amendments and modifications to make the questionnaires work by video call. So we prepared kind of a PDF version of the show cards so that interviewers could share the show cards on screen via the kind of share screen button with respondents. We had to make some adaptations to our cognitive assessments to make them work via video call. We were able to make adaptations for quite a lot of our cognitive assessments, but there were some cognitive assessments we decided not to do via video call. We had a self-completion section in our studies, kind of which include some sensitive questions, and we decided to administer that via a web survey instead. For the data linkage section of the questionnaires, normally there'd be a paper leaflet that the interviewer would hand to the respondent, but we kind of found a way for that information to be shared on screen with the respondent. And we also had to think about how to give out and collect back the paper self-completion questionnaires. So in the video call scenario, they had to be sent out in advance by the interviewer and then posted back by the respondent. Next slide, please. This is just an overview, I guess, of kind of how our fieldwork steps worked in our ways when we were only offering video call interviewing. So we still sent an advance letter and a leaflet from the office, kind of letting people know that we'd love them to take part in the survey, and it gave them some information about how the video calling approach might work. And then the initial contact was by the interviewer, and they were asking these two kind of key questions. Do you have access to an internet connected device that you can use for private video call? And they were trying to find out whether the respondent was willing to make an appointment for a video call interview. And if they were, then the interviewer was responsible for setting up and sending the Microsoft Teams invite, posting the interview back to the respondent. We experimented with either the interviewer ringing them the day before, or the office sending an automated reminder the day before to remind them about the interview, and then the actual video call interview would happen. And then we had several kind of automated reminders and things being sent out afterwards. Next slide, please. We have found, I guess, that many respondents on BCS 70 and NCDS particularly, but also on ELSA, many respondents were willing to take part and needed little convincing. Quite a lot of respondents said they were already using video calling, so they were fairly happy to use this method. Some people expressed some concern about whether the technology would work, but they did go on to successfully complete an interview. Of those who did a video call interview, almost all participants said they would be willing to do a video call interview again. Obviously, there were a proportion of respondents who said they'd prefer to wait for a face-to-face interview, and that proportion was probably bigger in the ELSA study than on BCS 70 and NCDS. And we did observe that when you're using a video call only approach, it is harder to make contact and engage with some cohort members remotely. Next slide, please. We found that some respondents found joining the call a bit difficult, but in the end, most did manage it. We had people joining on kind of various different devices, but the kind of video call interview process seemed to work fairly well for all those different devices. There were some internet connection issues, but these generally didn't stop the interviews proceeding. And we did find that training interviewers to do video call interviewing has been something we've spent quite a lot of time thinking about. Some interviewers have found learning these new video call interviewing skills quite challenging, but have said that their confidence has grown with practice, and the more they've done it. Next slide, please. So just got a couple of slides here on kind of the scale of what we've done. So from autumn 2020 to early 2022, we've been running video call kind of only waves of fieldwork. We did a small pilot on BCS 70 and slightly larger pilots on NCDS and ELSA. We did because those went quite well, we learned some things from them. We did a BCS 70 CAVI only soft launch in the summer last year, and then since then we've done several waves of BCS 70 and NCDS and ELSA of video call kind of only waves of interviewing. So these are waves where we've said to people, would you be willing to take part by video call? If yes, we interviewed them now, and if they said, oh, I prefer to wait for a face-to-face interview, then we kind of put them on the list for reissuing or reallocating in a later wave. So yeah, you can see, we have now done quite a lot of video call interviews, probably about 5,500 video call interviews if you kind of add up these interviews across all of these studies. Next slide. And just in terms of what we're doing at the moment, so kind of in the last few months, we've been able to return to face-to-face interviewing on all three of these studies. And so we've launched CAVI waves. So we've allocated cases to face-to-face interviewers, and we're asking them to try and get face-to-face interviews. But there is the option of respondents saying they prefer to do a video call interview if that's what they want. So we've kind of left it up to the respondent. The advanced letters mention the use of both face-to-face and video call interviews, and then the interviewers contact the cohort members to see what they prefer to do. In some cases, we've got video call and face-to-face interviewers who are also trained to do video calling, and in other situations, it might be that the face-to-face interviewer needs to arrange for the case to be reallocated to a video call interviewer. Yes, and these are kind of sample sizes of what's in field at the moment. It's probably too early to say exactly how things are going, and I think Carole is now going to talk a bit more about the kind of results we've observed so far, particularly on BCS 70 and NCDS. Over to you, Carole.
Hi, Kirsty, thanks very much. So we can't really assess the full effectiveness of this method of interviewing without closer inspection on the quality of the data we receive through interviews conducted by video call. And unfortunately, it's too early for us to assess the data in detail at this stage, because both our BCS 70 survey and the NCDS survey are currently still in field. However, I would like to present some interim findings based on those waves that are close to completion. In particular, I would like to look at some of our response figures. In our longitudinal studies at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies, we typically achieve high response rates for those face-to-face surveys. So prior to lockdown in 2020, we were achieving a response rate on our NCDS survey of around 79%. And in our BCS 70 last face-to-face survey, which was conducted when they were age 46 in 2016, we achieved a response rate of 73%. So as you can see here from the response rates we're achieving in video calls of around 50%, the response is comparatively lower than we would have achieved on our face-to-face surveys. But we do think that this is still a positive response rate for this method of interviewing, considering there are a number of limitations we have around contact and tracing activities using this remote method. So while respondents were asked to take part via video during the lockdown, they could request to have a face-to-face interview at a later stage when face-to-face was possible. And it seems that more of our cohort members in the NCDS survey, they're slightly older, they're in their early 60s, and more of these requested a face-to-face interview. So we have 13% on NCDS compared with only 6% on our BCS 70 survey. And as Kirsty mentioned, we have a number of different components to our surveys, so self-completion, cognitive tests, sensitive questions, data linkage, an online dietary questionnaire. So I really just wanted to highlight that the overall agreement to take part in these is in some cases slightly lower than our face-to-face, but but more or less comparable, not too much lower. So that's it in terms of the level of agreement, but there are some other practical considerations which have actually impacted on our overall response rate for these individual elements, which I hope to talk about, which I'd like to talk about now. So both on our face-to-face surveys and on our video call interviews, the paper self-completion questionnaires are posted in advance to our study members. And the advantage of on a face-to-face call is the interviewer can also pop in a paper questionnaire when they're in the area, or when they come to do the actual interview themselves. If the respondent has not received any of the paper documents, they can provide spares at this time. Another advantage in the face-to-face interview is that the interviewer is actually able to collect these documents during the interview. So we hope, and on our face-to-face survey, the interviewer will collect a completed self-completion during the interview. However, the difference we have on a video call is we're fully reliant on respondents receiving these documents in advance of the interview and posting them back following the interview. As you can see here, there's a slightly lower response rate for our self-completion questionnaires. However, I do want to talk a bit more about another document that we send in advance, and that's the letter cancellation document. And this is completed as part of the cognitive test, and it's completed during the interview. On our face-to-face surveys, the interviewer will provide the document during the interview and collect it once it's been completed during the interview. However, in our video call interviews, This document is provided in advance to study members along with the paper self-completion questionnaire. So when it comes to the interview itself, we hope that this document will have been received by the participants and they'll be able to pull it out in order to complete it during the interview. We also then ask for them to return it after the interview has finished. As you can see from the results here, we have considerably lower response rate for the return of this particular document. And there could be a number of reasons for this. We're finding that some of our respondents are returning the completed self-completion questionnaire before they've actually got to the interview stage. But they're not unable to do this with the letter cancellation document. This has to be completed during the interview. So it may well be that they've already returned one document and you know, they don't sort of want to make a separate journey to post back this the document. It may also be that they don't fully appreciate the significance of returning this letter cancellation document after it's been completed during the interview. I also just wanted to talk a bit further about how we administer the self-completion questionnaires. We're, again, despite agreement to complete these being high, our overall achieved response rate on for these self-completion questionnaires has been lower in the video call compared to face-to-face surveys. So in our face-to-face surveys, our sensitive questions are completed via CASI, so it's computer-assisted self-interviewing. So this point in the survey, the interviewer will provide the respondent with their laptop for them to enter in their responses themselves and privately. However, as Kirsty mentioned, for our video call interviews, we were unable to do this. So we programmed these sensitive questions into a web survey. And the interviewer, during the interview, will send the individual a link to this web survey via the MS Teams chat function and ask them to complete this web survey while they wait. So the interviewer will wait on the call and it takes around 10 minutes for this to be completed. We have introduced a second option, and we introduced this option following a review of our response rate after the pilot studies we took part, the pilot studies we conducted. So our second option is for the interviewer to share their screen with the participant and for the participant to read the questions themselves and to just provide a response for the interviewer to enter. In this way, they're completing this during the main interview. Whereas our third option is to send an email with a link to this web survey after the main interview has taken part. So that the respondents can complete this at a later stage. However, when we analysed our results, we did find that there were a number of, particularly when we're looking at the pilot and the soft launch for BCS 70, you can see that 12% were provided with the web survey to complete on NCDS and they didn't complete it, and this was 15% on BCS 70. So this is why we decided to introduce this option of screen sharing with the interviewer, providing their screen for the respondents to read and answer. And this has in fact boosted our overall return rate for the survey. So this has made a positive impact. However, we do acknowledge that the interviewer administering the self-completion questions in this way may impact on some response bias. And this is something we will look at further when we're looking at the main results. I just wanted to touch also on the quality of data we get from item non-response. So we've looked at four particular questions here where we typically get a higher item non-response rate. And I'm just comparing these with the video sweeps with a face-to-face sweep. And we can see there's no immediate pattern coming through. The reds are showing, those results in red are showing where we had a higher non-response, but equally so we have a number where the response in the video is actually lower. So it's very early stage looking at some of this data, and this is something we do hope to look at in a lot more detail once we get the final results. At this stage, I would like to pass over to Mary, who's going to talk you through some of the work that's been done on the cross-sectional surveys.
Thank you very much, Carole. And yes, I will talk about NatCen's experience of implementing video interviewing on a number of cross-sectional studies. So as you could hear, the experience on the longitudinal studies have been broadly positive, and a lot of people conduct doing the interviews via the video. So we were quite keen to see whether this is something that would also be useful on cross-sectional surveys, so where we don't have an established relationship with the participants. And we ended up trying it on 3 different surveys, which are quite different in themselves, which in itself is interesting just to see how it worked. So we were very much building on the longitudinal studies experience and doing some of the same things. So I won't go into the same level of detail on the implementation. So the studies where we did trial video interviewing were the Health Survey for England, or HSC, NatCen, or the National Study of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles, on the pilot of the study, and on ESS, which obviously is familiar to very many of the attendees today. So HSC, just to give just a bit of background as to what it is, if you don't know, is a really large cross-sectional survey in England, collecting information about health and health-related behaviours of adults, and it has 2 components: interview component, and then follow up by a research nurse to take biological measurements. NatCen, as the name says, this is the big gold standard sex survey that we run, and it is run every 10 years. And as you can imagine, it contains a lot of sensitive questions, and therefore has a lengthy self-completion section, and we do collect biological samples as well. And ESS, as you probably know, is coordinated on a European level, and the requirements of what needs done in terms of the questionnaire and the modes is all agreed centrally, and it covers social, political, and kind of moral issues across the EU, and therefore, as you can imagine, it does use a lot of show cards, and that was one of the considerations for us. Next slide. Right, so how did we implement video interviewing on those studies? It's very important to note here that for video interviewing, for none of the service was the only mode available. There was always at least one other mode available, and I think that might be one of the reasons why we did see the results that we did. So on HSC, it was set up to use telephone as an alternative mode, and then we ran a video pilot test alongside to see how that worked. The complication as well was that HSC at the time, at the start of 21, we were in a 3rd lockdown, so the fieldwork was conducted in an opt-in environment, so people opted into a telephone interview, and we changed to doorstep recruitment from April onwards in 2021. NatCen offered video, telephone, and face-to-face interviews, so they went into the field in June and July, so face-to-face was at that point an option that we could offer. And with ESS, the 2 modes that were available were video and face-to-face, and there was a pilot in May, June, I believe, in 21, and the main stage fieldwork with video interviewing started in August 2021 and is ongoing at the moment. Next slide. So in terms of the processes, some of the things that might be slightly different and what were the same compared to longitudinal studies, because we had more than one mode, we did have to ask people for mode preference. So when it was an opt-in situation on HSC, we had a question on the portal as to which mode people wanted to complete the interview in, and on a doorstep that a choice was handled by an interviewer. And on HSC, at least, we did brief interviews to offer the video interview as a first option. And as has already been said, we did not train all of our interviews in video interviewing. There was particularly as we were trying to see, is it something that does work before making a bigger investment. So we trained a small group of video interviewers, and ESS, for example, has also been using the telephone unit interviewers. And what that means is that we needed to reallocate video cases from non-video interviewers in the field to interviewers who were video trained. In terms of show cards, so on ESS, we used screen sharing, so like longitudinal studies. However, on HSC and NatCen, we we left them with the participant if it was a doorstep recruitment situation, or we did post them if it was an opt-in situation. With in terms of self-completions on HSC, so these were paper questionnaires which were posted after a remote mode interview by an interviewer, and on NatCen it was done as a longitudinal studies. It was done as a part of the interview where the interviewer stayed online while the participant completed the questionnaires. Next slide, please. So on HSC in particular, we did have debriefing sessions with interviews to see how things were going, and we also conducted some interviews with the participants who had completed the video interview to see what the experience was for them. And what we did find out was that interviewers and participants broadly enjoyed the process, didn't have any major technical difficulties, and participants particularly were saying that this is something that they quite routinely use, so it was not a problem for them. And also there was suggestion from both interviewers and respondents that video interviewing is more personal than telephone, that they can build a better rapport. But they also felt that video interviews might take a bit longer, and that's kind of reflecting maybe not the interview itself, but the whole process around it. So having to send an invite, test if everything is working, etc. So it's a bit more going on there. Right, next slide. So how did it go? As you heard on longitudinal studies, the take up, especially when the video was offered as the only mode, was really good. And this is not something that we saw on cross-sectional studies at all. So when we started off on HSC in the opt-in situation, we had what we thought at that time was a reasonable proportion of people preferring to do a video interview. However, when we went to doorstep recruitment from April onwards, when the restrictions were easing across the country, we were not able to get any interviews done over the video, despite specifically briefing interviews on the importance of this and asking them to prioritize this as a mode, and it just did not happen. On NatCen, during in the pilot, about 5% of participants opted to do it via the video, and on ESS, I believe in the pilot we only had one video case, and when we continued in the main stage, because we felt we needed to offer an alternative mode, only about 1% of the sample has requested a video interview, and more than half of those people have not actually followed through and completed the video interview. Next slide. So in terms of data quality, so as you can see, the number of participants that we've had has been so much lower that we haven't been able to really do the in-depth analysis that Carole has been able to do. So my observations here are very top level. On average, we found that it was younger participants who tended to opt for video interviews. When we looked at the item non-response on HSC, for example, we didn't see differences between the two modes, and the consent rates didn't appear to be particularly different either. On that side, we did observe a slightly higher return of the biosamples. However, that is based, I believe, on just 7 cases doing it via the video, so it's very small numbers still. And actually, the video interviews were slightly quicker to complete than telephone interviews, but that might reflect the sample who was doing that. So it's hard to read too much into it. Next slide, please. So we also debriefed interviewers on the reasons why they felt we didn't really get anything in the doorstep recruitment scenario on HSC. And these are the reasons that were mentioned. So both interviewers and participants seemed to feel like that was more of an hassle because telephone mode was available. It was seen as a lot easier to just do the appointment over the telephone rather than to have to set up a laptop with a software that they might not have had, etc. There's also something around interviewers who were not trained in video having to pass on the cases to video trained interviewers. You could see that they might be more motivated just to go out the interview via the telephone rather than pass it on to somebody else. We try to mitigate against this with the fee structure, but probably was not quite enough. And some participants also commented that they felt that the telephone offered them more privacy, so they didn't need to. They could just do it anywhere at home. They didn't need to, find a suitable background place where they could sit, etc. And that might be more of my observation really, but it also coincided at the time when just people's lives generally started to move offline a bit more, and it just might have been another thing that people were not that keen to do as a result. Next slide, please. Yep, so just finally, what did we end up then doing in those studies? So on HSC, we stopped offering video interviewing quite early on in 2021. On NatCen, we did not use this mode in the dress rehearsal that we have carried out since, and then plan to use it for the main stage of the study. And ESS carried on using video interviewing because there was no other alternative mode we could offer for participants. Right. Yep. So that's all on the cross-sectional studies, and I'm handing back to Carole to talk us through conclusions and next steps.
Thanks, Mary. I'm just going to summarise some of our conclusions and next steps based on our experience so far. So looking first at some of the practical considerations. So one of these is the technical capabilities. So one of them, the technical capability of the interviewer. So they have ability to conduct these video call interviews and be willing to do so. So this will have, there's additional training and costs that comes with this. There's also the ability of the respondents to participate. Do they have the equipment that's required, and are they willing to do so? And based on this, looking at both of these factors, it's important to have some sort of technical helpline for both interviewers and participants who are taking part via this mode. Another consideration we have is the switch between modes. So looking at whether you have a small pool of trained interviewers who are focused on doing the CAVI, or do you have your face-to-face, do you have a field force that's able to do both face-to-face and video calls? And we've looked at, we've had experience of both of these options, and both have advantages and disadvantages. We also, it's important to look at measurement, comparability and data quality. So one of a few factors to consider is whether you're showing the screens or showing show cards. What is your face-to-face interaction that you'd like to have? Are you, do you want to have the interviewer able to see the respondent for the majority of it, or are you showing the screen more often? And it's important to look at the data comparability across different modes and to look further at non-response bias. Another practical consideration I discussed was around the provision and the return of documents. So as I mentioned, we needed to send some documents in advance to be received in advance of the interview taking place. And of course, you have to allow the time for these documents to be received before the interview can take place. And of course, we're relying on individuals or respondents returning documents to us by post and video call, whereas in a face-to-face, you have that advantage of the interviewer being able to collect them. Another consideration is around the sample. So in our studies, we have the availability of telephone and email addresses, which I appreciate is not always possible for other studies. However, the tracing activities on a video call are limited. If you're doing it purely remotely, you are limited, interviewers are limited in the types of tracing that they can do. An advantage of a video call technique is the ability to reach some hard-to-reach groups. It could be those living abroad. So for us at CLS, we do have some of our cohort members who do live abroad, and it gives us the opportunity to interview them in this way. And there are also some individuals who may be living in more remote areas, and you may not wish to send an interview out to this particular location for a few addresses. So there are some cost considerations. So there's the setup costs, such as additional documents that might be needed to be printed. There's additional training that's required for the interviewers, and additional programming and researcher time to set up the questionnaire program so that it does incorporate some of the changes needed for video interviewing. And there's also additional field management time, particularly if you are moving cases between interviewers who are focused on face-to-face and those are focused on CAVI interviewing. There's video interviewing. There is an element of management time that goes into this. So a lot of the cost also depends on how many interviewers are trained to do video calls, whether you're training at where full field force is of interviewers is trained on video, or only a small niche group, and the cost of that, of course, will vary. And as Mary mentioned, you may need to change the fee structure you offer to motivate some interviewers that are not necessarily going to do the video call, but would pass that on to another interviewer. So they have to be motivated to be able to do that and be worth their while. There's potential cost savings for travel expenses. So you're not sending out a face-to-face interviewer to a remote area for just a few cases. And yes, in general, the travel expenses are saved through a video call interview. So just to really sum up our conclusion. So we found that the take-up for video calls, for video call interviewing was higher in our longitudinal studies, and particularly so when there is pandemic restrictions in place. So one thing we have found since we have gone back to face-to-face interviewing is very few respondents are actually choosing to do a video call. Most of them are happy to take part face-to-face. So the take-up we found is lower in the cross-sectional surveys, and it depends what other modes are available. As I've just mentioned, if the face-to-face is available, it seems that people have been more so opting for this. So it depends on how it's offered. Are you giving them a choice, or are you just saying, you know, this, we're asking you to take part via video? And I think the response and the take-up can vary depending on these factors. So a number, in terms of the future application of video call interviewing, I think there's a number of dependencies. And I think it depends very much on the type of survey you're doing, as we've highlighted the difference between longitudinal and cross-sectional surveys. I think it depends a lot on whether there are existing resources in place. So are the interviewers already trained to do video call interviews? So even though on BCS 70 and NCDS, we have moved on to focus on face-to-face interviews, we do have the advantage that we already have interviewers are trained to do video call techniques. So even for just a few video calls, it has not been an issue for us to issue them to these already trained interviewers. But you may well think differently if it was a case of training up interviewers just for a small number of cases. As I mentioned, there's benefits in this remote interviewing depending on your type of sample. Depending on where people are located, you may well save on travel expenses. And I think also there's some consideration in terms of how you incorporate other modes. Do you want to do a CAVI first mode and then move on to face-to-face, or are you offering the different modes as options? I think that's a consideration on how your response rates will pan out and how you design your study overall. One thing I think we'd like to highlight is there is a lot more research needed. We feel that we have done a lot of testing, and we've been able to achieve a high number of interviews. So we do have the advantage of having this resource to analyse further, and we hope to do so at the Centre for Longitudinal Studies. And we have some research questions we'd like to look at in particular, such as what are the characteristics of the respondents who take part in video interviews, and how does this compare to other modes? And what is the impact of offering video interviewing on sample composition and non-response bias? and how comparable is data collection via video with data collected via other modes. So at CLS, we really do hope to look into a number of these questions, research questions, in more detail once we get our final data. So that is our presentation for today, and hopefully we're around to answer any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Carole, and thanks, Kirsty and Murray. That's a really interesting presentation on a new method, and great to see how it's worked across lots of different surveys and types of surveys. So thanks very much for presenting. We've got about just over 10 minutes for questions. They're still coming in, so if people still have questions, please do post them. We'll get through as many as we can. I'll go through a few now, and obviously I'll leave it up to you in terms of who responds. There were a couple on costs, and I think Carole touched on this a little bit in the conclusion. So whether you've compared or evaluated differences in cost between modes, and whether there were any cost savings or unexpected costs associated with the video interviewing. Can you say anything more about that?
Kirsty, is this something you may well be able to answer? I know from our experience, I think, yeah, the cost of training the interviewers, I think, is something to consider, and it was quite time intensive to get the interviewers up to the level we wanted for the video calls to work well, and it's something that I think is to be factored in. Kirsty, I'm not sure based on experience.
Yeah, I think our experience so far in NatCen is there are quite considerable kind of setup costs, or the initial investment and the initial training of interviewers, and yeah, setting things up to work for video call interviewing. So probably the actual cost, you know, for the interviewer actually doing it, possibly there is a bit of a saving relative to a face-to-face interview, but I think we're going to have to wait, I think, until the end of these projects to see overall, you know, did we make a saving or not on our cabbie? Because obviously, I suppose the cost per interview, if you add in all the fixed costs, it varies, it's going to fluctuate depending on how many video call interviews we actually finish up doing. So if we'd spent a lot of time up front and then only finished up doing a few hundred video call interviews, you know, that would have been a very expensive endeavour. Whereas if we get to the end of fieldwork and we've done, I don't know, half our interviews by video call, then probably, you know, as a cost things, yes. So we will have to look, I think, in more detail. Certainly I think our feeling so far is it's not coming out as dramatically cheaper based on what we've done so far.
Okay, thank you. There's something else, a bit around financial considerations as well. This is about the remuneration of interviewers that are required to have extra skills. So I think this is quite an interesting area, because I guess you have interviewers performing kind of different roles. So you have your traditional sort of face-to-face interviews who also need to offer a video interview. Then you have some of those interviewers who also become video interviewers. And then you have maybe, I don't know, old former telephone interviewers who are now doing video interviews but not actually doing any face-to-face interviews. So you've got a mix of different types of interviews there. What were the sort of key points you considered there around, did you have to kind of adjust your existing pay structures for interviews because you're requiring them to do more? Can you say anything around that?
I guess it might be different for cross-sectional studies, but for our longitudinal studies, we basically used the same pay structure for our video call interviewers as we did for face-to-face interviews. So we didn't explicitly pay interviewers more to recognise, you know, any specialist skills. I suppose we were, yeah, paying them for the time we expected it to take them to do the admin and to carry out a video call interview, and obviously we paid them for their time to attend the training. There was some feedback from interviewers. Yeah, some interviewers did say that, you know, there is a case for saying maybe they should be paid more because it's more of a specialist skill. That isn't something that we've kind of explicitly pursued at the moment, but possibly it is something. And now we're in a position to think: has this mode got a place kind of going forward now pandemic restrictions ease? Maybe we will have to look at costs again, because I know, Mary, you touched on the fact there is something interesting around kind of what are the incentives for interviewers to carry out interviews via different modes. We did have a reallocation fee though. If a face-to-face interviewer approaches somebody and they say, I'd rather do a video call interview, we did make sure we paid the face-to-face interviewer at least some fee to kind of recognise that they had a role in persuading that person to do an interview, and vice versa. If somebody was approached to a video call and said that I'd prefer to do a face-to-face interview, we did kind of have a reallocation fee there that paid. So there's some incentive for them to reallocate. That's more appropriate. Mary, I don't know if it worked differently on cross-sectional studies.
No, I think it was broadly the same. So we didn't pay more for video interviews for doing the interviews via the video, and it's not something that they can commented on us for. And yes, we also had a reallocation fee for the non-video interviews to pass it on. It's just I think for interviews often you're getting the interview, getting the agreement is one of the hardest things of their job. So and also the reallocation fee was not the same as doing the telephone interview. So these are the fees that on cross-sectional studies would be comparing. So there was still a financial incentive for them to just do the telephone interview themselves rather than to pass it on. If the participant was willing to do it via the telephone, it must have played some role in the falling off the cliff that we experienced. But then the interviewers who were video trained themselves and could do video interviews, they also didn't get any video interviews in that scenario on HSE specifically. So it's not the whole story, and we really can't be paying both interviewers a full fee for just one interview. So yeah, it's a tricky one.
I know we also had some discussion when we were talking about should we pay interviewers more for this specialist skill of video interviewing. One of the, I guess, reasons we didn't pursue it is because one of the discussions we had is that, you could argue there's lots of specialist skills we want interviewers to have, and all projects, there's lots of lots of differences between different projects and the things we're asking interviewers to do, and possibly it would be unhelpful to get into a thing of saying this is more special as a skill than other things we're asking interviewers to learn and do. But as it might be something we consider again in future.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the reallocation fee I thought was quite interesting, because that's something we've considered here. You sort of need the fee to be large enough to encourage them to offer the other option, but not too large that they kind of do that rather than pushing for the face-to-face interview. So yeah. It's interesting. Okay, the questions are coming in. We might not go through everything, but there's one on additional training. So what do the additional training for online consist of? I guess that's maybe just asking for more information on the additional training for interviewers who are doing the video interviewing. Can we say anything more about that?
Yes, so I suppose our training that we developed was we invited interviewers to kind of an online MS Teams session originally it was run by people in research, and now we're running it people in kind of the field team running it, about a day in total, but kind of split into two bits. So we had one bit that was focusing on kind of foundation Microsoft skills that you need to know to be able to do this, and then the second bit of the training focusing more specifically on here are the things you need to be able to do to carry out one of our longitudinal studies, for instance, in our case, via video call. Because one of the things we found is that there are some interviewers who, we needed to show them things like, here's how you download an attachment and save it on your hard drive, and here's how you navigate to your taskbar or flick between screens. Or there was some basic skills that we needed to kind of help people get familiar with before we could start showing them, here's how you set up an MS Teams invitation, and here's how you share your screen, and here's how you share a sound file. So we had, a kind of an online session that was broken into two bits, and we've kind of played around with whether that's better on two separate days or one long day. And then something we felt was quite effective was we encouraged people to get into pairs and do paired practice together. So they were paired up with somebody else who was also going through the training, and they could practice together. I'll be the interviewer, you be the respondent. Now you be the interviewer, I'll be the respondent. And they could kind of work through the different things we were asking them to do and give each other feedback. And they used a version of the practice program to do that. And then we had a sort of an accreditation process where after they'd done their paired practice and had the chance to kind of practice themselves, they would have somebody, a senior member of the field team would do an accreditation session with them where they'd go through with a bit of a tick list and say, can you do these, 9 things that you need to be able to do a video call interview. And then once they passed if they didn't pass the accreditation, they were there to sort of try and offer them support and coaching as needed. So hopefully everybody would get through. Yes, and then I suppose on an ongoing basis, we've made sure that interviewers know who they can call if they've got problems from a technical point of view.
Great, thank you. I think we've probably got time for one more. I'll try and sort of combine a couple of them so we get a bit of a try and answer as many as we can. But so there was a question, the longitudinal survey results showed substantially lower response rates compared to the previous data collection. Were there any patterns in this observable? And then there's also a later question about the characteristics of those who opt for video interviews. So I guess could sort of combine those and say, you know, which groups were kind of better represented in video than we see in face-to-face, and which groups were kind of relatively more excluded. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, I'll start. I'm afraid my answer for now is we're still looking into this. We did look very briefly at the data, and we couldn't actually see any differences on the characteristics of those taking part via video and those taking part face-to-face. But really, we want to make sure our studies fully finished, just in case there was any particular characteristics in the sample of that wave that might have swayed the results at all. So it is something we so far we can't see any significant difference in those taking part, but I think it's very early days, and I think it's something we'd like to analyze in detail once the study is complete. So yeah, and yeah, in terms of those participating or not, again, it's something we look into in more detail, but it seems that even between our two cohorts, the varying age, we have BCS 70 who are slightly younger, they're in their 50s, and the NCDS in their early 60s, and there's not a great deal. Their response figures are looking very similar so far. There just seems to be more on our NCDS cohort that have requested to take part via video, but they seem to have adapted and be willing to take part in video calls in most cases. But it's something we will look at in more detail, looking at those non-respondents that were asked to take part via video and haven't done, and looking at those who take part via video compared to face-to-face. So yeah, I'm afraid it's something we will look at more detail, but as yet we're not seeing anything coming through that seems to show a difference.
Great. Thanks, Carole. It's 1 o'clock, so I think we'll have to close there. I realise there's a few questions we didn't get to, so apologies for that. I'm sure the speakers would be happy if you get in touch directly if you want more information or specific questions answered. So please do that if you would like to discuss further. But I think we'll close there. So thanks very much, particularly to the speakers, so Carole, Kirsty, and Mary, and to you for attending. There will be a recording circulated as well. So yeah, thank you, and hopefully we'll see you at the next of our Method Seminar series. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.